Hey everyone. One of the first things that we discuss in this course is why multicultural marketing? Why is this such an important topic? And why is it so important for marketing professionals to be trained in the research and development of consumer insights for business? This is the first thing that we talk about in chapters 1 of both Morse and Mueller. They kind of trace the history of the United States in relation to multiculturalism and immigration. And so we will start really at the beginning, which is with immigration. Since the beginning of the United States of America, the country has been characterized by immigrant immigrant populations, immigration. And so we have, apart from the Native Americans, the majority of the U.S. population are really coming from somewhere else. We can all trace our origins back to some other country, some other continent. And so that has characterized the growth of the U.S. population for a very long time. So if we look back at the big waves of immigration that have occurred in the early 20th century, the vast majority of immigrants from the U.S. came from one continent. So over half of the immigration into the U.S. was coming out of Europe. So people were coming from countries like Poland, Italy, Germany, to cities like New York and Chicago. And so the vast majority of those populations were immigrants from Europe. And so immigration in the U.S. is not something new. And the very tumultuous relationship, the very strange relationship that has occurred between the U.S. population and the immigrant population has been going on for as long as we can remember. So when we look at our text, we will see that in 1751, Benjamin Franklin was complaining about the German immigrants who were coming into the country. And so it was a question of, do we change them or do they change us? Right? In the 1850s, Henry James was complaining about the Italians, right? And now we are in this time. There is a ton of complaints about immigrants from the Middle East, from Latin America, right? And so we can see that the discourse or conversation, the rhetoric around immigration has not changed very much over time. One of the things that we ask, and it's one of the questions that we try to settle really early out, is this distinction between melting pot versus salad bowl. Many people will talk about America as a melting pot, but what a melting pot actually is a country or a culture where people from other cultures come into this culture. They basically lose their cultural identity from wherever it is that they were coming from, and they absorb and adopt the cultural practices and the cultural identity of the country that they currently inhabit, right? And so when we talk about melting pots, that is what a melting pot actually is. So you will see that, for example, in Morse's book, he talks about Alba and Nee, who feel that the melting pot still currently exists and that people assimilate, meaning, like I said, they basically lose their cultural identity from the country that they're coming from and take on the American culture. However, demographers and historians today, persons who do social science research will tell you that America is not really a melting pot. What we consider America to be is a salad bowl or a mosaic. And what we mean by that is that people inside the U.S. have distinct cultural identities from varying places, and they are able to maintain and retain those cultural identities while coexisting with the mainstream population, with other cultures inside the United States. It is not necessary, it's not required to lose your cultural identity in order to survive in the United States. Now, this is a huge departure from what used to exist. So when we look back into the early 20th century, and even not too long ago in the US, basically immigrants were forced to assimilate. And assimilate, by assimilating, they would have to basically be American, act like everybody else. They'd have to not use their language in public. If they use it at home, children were encouraged to learn English and speak English because that was how you were going to be accepted and be successful in the United States. We can all agree that that is not the case anymore. There are certain cities that you go to. Miami is a very good example where Spanish is spoken more than English. Right? And so people are able to survive in the U.S., be successful in the U.S. while maintaining their cultural identity. There are no external pressures, right, to change your cultural identity just to be accepted inside the U.S. And so that's the first thing that we want to talk about. And when we talk about the salad bowl that is the U.S. or the mosaic that is the U.S. now, what we are referring to is what we call acculturation, right? And when people acculturate, they basically adopt some of the behaviors and traditions and customs from the country that they currently live in. However, at the core, they still maintain their cultural identity from the country that they are from or that their forefathers are from, right? And so they basically become kind of what we call bicultural. They still practice and maintain their own home country culture, but they also practice and adopt certain behaviors and aspects of their host country culture. So home country that I was originally from or that my parents or grandparents were from. Host country that you currently live in. And so we are moving from the whole thought process of assimilation, which is the melting pot, to acculturation, which is the mosaic or the salad bowl. When we look at the U.S. population, one of the things that we notice is that for we've only been collecting information on multicultural populations just recently. In fact, even though the census has been collecting information about race, self-identified race, since the 1970s, since the late 1700s, the census only started collecting information on Hispanic identity in 1970. And when we talk about race, we are talking about persons' self-identification of race according to the census when they complete the census questionnaire. But in this course, we really focus more on ethnicity, and an ethnicity is really a large enough group, a sizable group that share racial, cultural, language, religious, national commonalities that basically make them similar to each other. And so when we think of an ethnicity, those persons do not have to be of the same race. So for example, Hispanics. Hispanic is not a race because Hispanics are black, brown, white, they look Asian, they can be of any racial group, right? But from a cultural perspective, they are Hispanic. So when you look at countries like Colombia, Cuba, Panama, very diverse, right? Because they have heavy immigration from Asia, from all over the world, right? And so because of that, when we are talking about ethnic groups and ethnicities, which is what we will discuss throughout this course, we are not talking about race because, like we said, a lot of ethnic groups are not about race. LGBTQ is not about race. Hispanic is not about race, right? Because these groups can consist of anybody who looks pretty much any way, right? And so that's one of the things that I want also for us to kind of wrap our heads around as we move forward, right? So in terms of multicultural, when we say multicultural, what we mean is being off, relating to, or including several cultures. So this is more than what we consider mainstream culture. So in the U.S., we consider the typical perception of American culture as mainstream. However, we do know that there are people who are from other cultures who are also existing inside the U.S., right? And so we consider those persons who are, for example, you know, born to Hispanic parents here in the U.S. or born to Asian parents here in the U.S. or, are mixed race, mixed cultures, right? And so multicultural population has to do with people who can claim two or more cultures as part of their background, their identity, right? And so when we think about the large groups that are recorded in the census and that are tracked really in the U.S., we look at African Americans, we look at Hispanic or Latinos, we look at Asian Americans or Asian Pacific Islanders, right? And those are the big groups based on the census. One of the things that you will see in Mueller's text is that, for example, Hispanic or Latino labels what people want to be called: Black versus African American, Asian American or Asian Pacific American. These are some of the questions that come up when we talk about multicultural marketing. And what we realize is that for some people, labels do not matter, right? And for other persons, some persons may, for example, among Hispanics, some persons may prefer to be called Hispanic, others may prefer to be called Latino because it is a little bit more inclusive. But again, the vast majority of people don't care, right? And so those are some of the things that you will begin to realize. So we have kind of, bounced around talking about some of the, the history of where the multicultural population in the U.S. has been coming from and how long this has been a phenomenon in the U.S. But in recent times, especially since the 2000 census, multicultural has become a little bit bigger, a little bit more of a talking point, a little bit more important, and big business, huge corporations, Fortune 500 companies, have now had to kind of sit up and take notice of these populations. Why? Because the multicultural population in the U.S. is really driving the growth of the population. In terms of achievement also, they are growing, moving beyond what they were doing in the past. And so we're going to talk about some of those factors really quickly. One of the things that we've talked about really is the birth rate, so growth in those populations, right? In the past, immigration used to be the key determinant of the growth of the multicultural population, but that is no longer the case. For example, when we look at Hispanics, in the last census, in the 2010 census, Hispanics accounted for over half of the total growth in the U.S. population, and I'm talking about U.S. births, meaning Hispanics who were born inside the U.S. So, for example, in this, even though his immigration is still a big topic, actually in the U.S., immigration, especially Hispanic immigration from, for example, Mexico, is pretty much flat because right now births are accounting for the vast majority of Hispanics in the U.S. African Americans, we know that there are immigrant groups, right, coming from Africa, coming from the Caribbean, right, that are contributing to the African American population. But since the end of slavery, the vast majority of the African American population has been as a result of births inside the U.S. And when we talk about African Americans, we really think about integration versus acculturation or even assimilation. And you will see that also being discussed because African Americans are Americans. They have been here longer than most other immigrant groups, and they are pretty much the only group who migrated to the U.S. without having a choice, pretty much the vast majority of them, because slavery did contribute the vast majority of people of African descent to the United States population. And so we have, but the one group, however, that still the vast majority of their growth is accounted for through immigration is actually the Asian American population. And you will find that they are the fastest growing immigrant group in the US. So and just to underscore, immigrant group meaning group of persons who are coming from outside the US. For the most of the other ethnic groups, the growth in those populations are fueled by births inside the US. One of the other things that makes the multicultural population so important to business is that the median age for the multicultural population is significantly lower than the non-Hispanic white population, which means the vast majority of youth in the US are multicultural. And when you look at the millennial population, is also extremely diverse, which means minorities are fueling the growth of the U.S. population, while the non-Hispanic white population is aging and the population is not being replaced at the rate that it needs to be. So we see projections that by 2050 or thereabouts, the U.S. will be a minority majority, meaning all the minority groups together will make up over 50% of the U.S. population, and that has a lot to do with births inside the U.S. And so when we talk about the persons who are now aging into, for example, the labor force, right? Enrollment in universities, voter registrations, new voter registrations. A lot of these people are coming from the minority groups. And so minorities are becoming more and more important, for example, to electoral candidates who want to get elected. When we look at the labor force as well, when we look at, for example, the aging populations, people who are going into retirement, a non-Hispanic white population is going to comprise a lot of that group. But when you look at the labor force, so we're talking about people who are now able to earn, people whose incomes are going to be growing, people who are going to be starting families, a lot of these people are coming from the multicultural segments. So when we think about businesses who are trying to grow their customer base, who are trying to have loyal customers who are going to be around for a long period of time, they have to look to the youth population. A lot of products and services that are being developed for the youth population, which also underscores why this lower median age, having a huge number of the youth population being multicultural, being something that businesses have to pay attention to. One of the other things that we have seen is the distribution of minority populations, right? In the past, we used to have where minority populations kind of cluster around certain regions and states, and so you had high populations in certain areas, and then there were other areas that were not as diverse. While this phenomenon still continues, we are seeing a greater geographic dispersal, meaning people are now moving out of those strongholds, especially among Hispanics. We see the opposite trend for African Americans, where they are moving to the suburbs of those cities that tend to have higher African American populations, but Hispanics are moving out of Hispanic communities and into other communities where the Hispanic population was not so low. And so what we are seeing now is that the diversity of states and cities is no longer limited to a few states or a few cities. It's becoming more and more widespread. People are moving now more and more to other states, and so you're going to see more states becoming more diverse, more cities becoming more diverse, and that is going to continue to increase over time. One of the other things is educational attainment. In the past, it was always assumed that minority populations, especially Hispanics and African Americans, that they basically were more likely to drop out of high school, less likely to be college educated. And so because of that, you know that educational attainment also affects earning, right? The amount of buying power and income that people have. But we're seeing now that minorities are catching up. They are now finishing high school, they're getting into college, they're getting college degrees, which speaks very well for their earning potential in the future. So again, we're looking at this labor force, the future labor force, and we're also looking at the future buying power and household incomes that these people will be able to command and are commanding, as, for example, millennials who are from minority backgrounds come of age. We know that the millennials are the most educated generation, because the vast majority of these people have at least some college education, and so they're able to command higher incomes. And we are in business. We're in business to make money. We want consumers with disposable income, so we can see how educational attainment is becoming one of those things that says, yes, these people are going to be earning more and more. They're going to become more and more important to the success of business as time goes by. And of course, as I said, linked with education, we talk about ethnic buying power that continues to grow. Their income continues to grow. So even though Hispanics and African American, their median income is less than the national average and less than non-Hispanic whites, for example, and less than Asian Americans, who have the highest buying power, by the way, and the highest level of educational attainment, we're seeing that their incomes are not flat, they are going up. So even though these groups traditionally have not earned as much as other groups, their incomes are rising, their buying powers are rising. And that is, of course, something that businesses must take a note of. So clearly, these factors do not just exist in a vacuum. Like I said, they have implications for marketers and for business, for industry, for commerce, right? Because it has resulted in the growth of the products and services that are made available, whether being imported or new products or services that are being created specifically for multicultural populations. So we see, for example, Shea Moisture is one of those big brands, Carol's Daughter, for the natural hair of the African American person. We also see a lot of products and services now for the Hispanic population, right? And that is going to continue. Over the years, we have seen this, and it will continue. Media is also changing. Not only does mainstream media, meaning the regular TV you watch, ABC, Fox, CBS, all those regular channels, we are seeing more and more diverse content being programmed into these channels. We also see where we are seeing now specialty or ethnic focused media being created, TV and radio stations, right? And online media as well. And so we see that we're seeing more diversity in content and programming, right? And that is as a result of, again, the growing multicultural population. Of course, we are also seeing ads and ad agencies. So we can trace the development of multicultural ad agencies all the way back to the 1970s, starting with the African Americans. The Hispanic agencies are only a few decades old, but they continue to grow and continue to be more important as more and more businesses are seeking services and the help of marketing professionals to target and develop content specifically for the multicultural population. Clearly, this has not been an overnight thing. We are talking about populations that have been here for centuries, but we are just seeing in the 21st century the growth in content, media, and advertising that is geared towards this group. I think it is Mueller or Morse who it's Morse who has talked about how the programming, the advertising towards minorities has changed over time. There was a time when there was no advertising to minorities. These groups were pretty much ignored, even though they were consuming. Also, in many instances, lower quality products were made available for them to purchase, and so businesses would benefit from the income of these groups, but they would not do any advertising to these groups. There was no multicultural advertising or marketing. Then, of course, we saw that the advertising to African Americans to Hispanics and to Asians when they just started were very stereotypical. There were kind of caricatures, cartoons, distorted images that were presented of these persons, and so the Mexicans were or Hispanics were portrayed as, for example, the Chiquita lady in the ruffled skirt and the fruit-laden hat, or the lazy Hispanic male with the shirt open and the chest hair is exposed, or the Asian American, the exterminator, the laundromat. And those were the portrayals, and so they were caricatures pretty much, and so they were quite, for us now, we think surprising and quite racist, to be honest. And now we are seeing where in the 60s it changed somewhat. For example, for African Americans, where it was in the 60s that we saw the first non-stereotypical portrayal of an African American male in a commercial, in a print ad. And the New York Times, or it was Time magazine, that also picked up and ran an article that was talking about the growing importance of the Black consumer. Most of the other ethnic groups have pretty much come the exact same journey, like we said, starting with these caricatures, moving into now we are seeing more and more representation that is less stereotypical, more reflective of the realities and the lives of these people. I think I will stop here for now, but what I will encourage you guys to do is, of course, read Morse and Mueller, please, right? And go through that first chapter, make your notes, and feel free to drop me an email to make an appointment to come to my office hours if you have any questions. So that's it for this topic, and look out for another video or next set of readings. All right, take care.